Hello everyone, my name is Marcos Underwood. I'm the Chief Scientist at MSI DFAT through my consulting business Tutuli Enterprises. Today I'm going to be discussing with you the results of a study that we performed at MSI DFAT, about which I wrote a paper and also presented a paper at the Shock and Vibration Symposium this past September. The title of the paper is Comparisons of the Structural Response of a Test Article that's excited by DFAT, diffuse, and non-diffuse acoustic fields. The paper discusses the use of the Direct Field Acoustic Test to excite an aluminum honeycomb 4-foot by 8-foot test panel using 4 types of acoustic fields. The testing goal was to assess how effectively a nearly diffuse, a non-diffuse uniform coherent, a directed coherent field, and a meso-generated acoustic field excite the test panel's structural resonances. The analysis of the results from the testing are presented to demonstrate the dependence of the test panel's PSD resonance response characteristics on each of the 4 types of acoustic fields that were used to excite the test panel. The study found that when using the same acoustic overall sound pressure level and reference spectrum profile, the reference STM coherence and phase settings used for the first 3 MIMO tests have a fundamental effect on the nature of the test panel's response. The 3 non-diffuse tests consistently missed properly exciting significant resonances. Their panel responses exhibited enhancement, cancellation, and phantom resonance effects, as I'll show later in the presentation. Only the diffuse acoustic field properly excited and identified the panel's structural resonances, with no such response effects as we saw for the non-diffuse test. The results matched those found by a separate modal analysis. The paper further found that the meso non-diffuse test performed the poorest, while only saving 1.3 dB of power as compared to what the MIMO diffuse field required without its advantages. In this slide, I'm showing you the test profiles that were used to conduct all 4 acoustic tests. In the upper left, I'm showing you the test profile in PSD format, a narrowband that was used for the actual control. On the upper right, I'm showing you the test profile in the more conventional acoustic form, which is a 3rd octave sound pressure level spectrum. The test level at which we ran the 4 tests was 138.5 dB. MIMO rectangular adaptive control was used for the first 3, and meso control used for the last of the 4 tests. For the 4 tests, control was narrow band and used the above PSD reference on the upper left using 24 control microphones. The MIMO test used the reference STM with different coherence and phase settings for each test. Meso, on the other hand, used a single reference, a single drive, and controlled the average of the 24 control mics, and we measured the resultant phase and coherence as a result of the meso test to compare to what we saw with the MIMO testing. MIMO used the same reference PSD for the 24 diagonal elements of the reference spectral density matrix for the 24 control microphones using an 8x24 MIMO control. In other words, 8 drives and 24 control microphones. This next slide shows the overall testing configuration. The drawing shows 8x8 stack configurations with 8 drives and 24 control microphones. It consists of 8 MP150 mid-high acoustic actuators and 8 MP21 subwoofer speaker stacks to cover the entire frequency range. A 14-foot by 12-foot elliptic microphone configuration was used around the panel. The panel was suspended from a ceiling and anchored to the floor with bungee cords at the center of the microphone ellipse. It's shown by the horizontal arrow that you see in the center of the drawing. The panel was instrumented as shown in the following photograph. The 10 response accelerometers were mounted on the panel as shown by the white circles. Accelerometers A1 through A3 are shown as a horizontal line near the center of the panel, and then microphone 4, accelerometer 4 is shown and 5 as in a vertical line down the middle of the plate, and then accelerometers A6 through A10 are shown in approximately diagonal fashion going to the lower right hand. The suspension of the panel is shown by the upper bungee cord supporting the weight, and then the lower two bungee cords anchoring the panel to the floor with those weights. In the center of the panel, we have placed a point mass that's also served as damping to make the identification and excitation of the resonances more difficult. A subsequent modal test and analysis was used to identify the first 16 resonances for comparison. The damp resonances obtained from the modal analysis were used to compare to the peaks, to the resonant peaks we found in the PSDs as a result of each of the 4 tests. The first 3 tests were configured to use 8x24 rectangular MIMO adaptive control. All 3 MIMO tests used initial coherence and phase settings that a subsequent characterization low-level test was used to determine an optimized reference spectral density matrix and impedance matrix to use for the actual test, as described by another recent paper of mine that I presented at the 32nd ATS conference on October 5th. That paper is also available on the website for your viewing if you're interested. The diffuse test, R5A, used initial settings of 0.0 for coherence and 0.0 degrees for phase to approximate a diffuse acoustic field in the least mean squared error sense. The non-diffuse test, R5B, used initial settings of 0.6 for coherence and 0.0 for phase to approximate a uniform non-diffuse acoustic field. The non-diffuse test R4A used initial settings of 0.7 for coherence and variable phase settings to approximate a non-diffuse directive uniform acoustic field that approached the panel perpendicular to its normal surface and left the field on the rear by suitable choices of phase for the phase settings. The non-diffuse MIMO test R5E controlled its drive to cause the average of the 24 control microphones to match the reference PSD. The coherence and phase responses were not controlled, but were measured and depend on the test article, the acoustic modes, and standing waves present in the acoustic volume that was created. The following here shows a summary of the test results we show for R5A. I present the phase results in the paper, but in the interest of time and space, I'm showing you here on the upper left all 24 control microphones shown in PSD format overlaid on each other. As you can see, the uniformity of the control responses is quite good. They correspond to each other and to the reference, which is the red line in the center of the display. The spread of control responses is within the plus and minus 3 dB tolerances that were used. On the upper right, I'm showing you the coherence between microphones 1 and 2, 1 and 3, 1 and 4, also up to 1 to 24. You can see that the closest microphones show the highest coherence and an approximate sync function squared shape. As the spacing between the microphones increases, the coherence at 25 Hertz declines and reaches a nearly zero value when the spacing is greater than a quarter of a wavelength, as I described in more detail in the paper. The coherence and control responses are what you expect from a uniform diffuse acoustic field. The test excites all the expected test panel resonances properly, as I'll show in the next slide. On this slide, I'm showing you the PSDs of the 10 accelerometers that were placed on the panel as I described earlier. In the upper corner, upper left-hand corner, you can see the RMSs of all the respective accelerometers that were used. The peaks of the resonances are highlighted with cursors, as you can see. All the resonances that were found by modal analysis are shown on that plot and by well-defined spectral peaks. Now, the objective of the study was to identify which acoustic field is best for testing a critical test article. The zoom plot shows the PSDs of the 10 accelerometers. It's zoomed between 35 Hertz and 300 Hertz. As I said, it identifies all the 16 resonances found during R5A via the tag cursors. These correlate very well with the 16 damp resonances found by a modal test and analysis that I'll show in the next slide. The results from the test R5A support the objective of the study. It was the best test in doing so. In this slide, in this table, I'm showing you the tabulated frequencies, damping, resonant frequencies, the observed resonant frequencies in test R5A, and the observation discrepancies in percentage. The modal test and analysis was used to identify the first 16 damp resonances. The damp resonances were used to compare to the frequencies of the peaks of the PSDs found during the various tests. The 16 damp resonances, observed resonances, and their discrepancies are shown in the rightmost three columns. The match between them is in the last column is within a few percent for most of the frequencies, with a couple near 5%, which is quite good comparison between theoretical and experimental results. All 16 resonances were identified properly by the test R5A, and only test R5A was able to do so, as will be shown in the later discussion. This and the later results show that the diffuse acoustic tests are best for testing significant structures, where all the externally excitable structural resonances are excited properly. In this slide, I'm showing you the mode shapes that we found during the modal analysis and testing that we did. The upper left block contains modes 1 through 4. The upper right block contains modes 5 through 8. The lower right block contains modes 13 to 16, and the lower left block contains modes 9 through 12. In this slide, I'm showing you the comparable results of what we saw for R5A for test R5B. The control and coherence results match what's expected from a non-diffuse acoustic field. As you can see on the upper left, the microphone variations with respect to the reference and with each other are higher. There's less uniform. Also on the upper right, we see the coherence between microphones for the first same pairage, 1 through 2, 1 through 3, 1 through all the way up to 1 to 24, are much higher by design. You don't see the decline in coherence at the lower frequencies like we saw for R5A. But this non-diffuse acoustic field does not excite all the expected test panel's resonances properly. The phase is nearly zero between microphones below 140 Hertz, which is the probable cause of the response cancellation enhancement effects that we see in the test results and as the paper explains. This now is this plot shows the PSDs and the RMSs of the 10 accelerometers that were mounted during R5A and B. As we can see on the lower left there, the resonance at the lowest frequency resonance is not well defined by this test. It shows actually notches at those frequencies, and as you all know, the lowest frequency resonance is the one that has the largest structural deflections and therefore the most significant in testing a test article. So you can see other notable differences as a result of the exciting. There's phantom resonances. There's resonances where there isn't a resonance, as we can see at the lower frequencies, and also around 137.5 hertz, 165 hertz, and 156 hertz. There's also evidence of resonance, response enhancement and cancellation, where in many cases the responses of the resonance are less than what we see with our test R5A, and we also see enhancement of some resonances compared to what we see in R5A. Now the third MIMO non-diffuse test that we ran was test R4A. In this case, we're creating a directed coherent field to excite the test article, and this is a field that approaches the test panel from the front, perpendicular to its surface, and leaves the panel's rear towards the excitation speakers. Again, we did this by suitable choices for the phase and the coherent settings, as I described in the paper. The results here are, as far as microphone uniformity is concerned, are slightly better than what we see in test R5B, but not as well as what R4A performs. And on the upper right, I'm showing you the coherence. It's higher by design. The phase response of that directed field is nearly zero between the control microphones as it approaches the plate, as I show in the paper in more detail. But the downside is it does not excite all the expected test panel resonances properly. It shows many examples of phantom resonances and response enhancement and cancellation, more so than what we see with R5B. So here are the comparable acceleration responses of the 10 mounted accelerometers on the test article. We can see that on the lower left there, test R4A identifies the resonance of the lowest frequency mode as 53 hertz. There's no real obvious peak at 43 hertz, like we saw for test R5A. And this is a result of exciting it with a nearly coherent field that's hitting it basically at all points on the structure at almost in phase, approximately in phase. It shows more notable differences in the PSD responses. Resonance seen for test R5A are not as well defined or excited by test R4A. Phantom resonances are seen that are not in the modal analysis results, particularly as I've shown at 53.1, around 75 hertz. Around 103 hertz, and more notably around 137.5, where we see a phantom resonance at 128 hertz, below the 137.5 hertz that we don't see in test R5A. So it shows more evidence of response enhancement and cancellation, and significant cancellation of the resonance around 137.5. Many of the microphone accelerometers saw no peak at 137.5 for this test. Here I show the comparable test results for test R5E, the MISO acoustic test. Since it's controlling the average of the microphone responses, the average is shown as the green line in the center of the microphone variation about the reference. You can see it's considerably more spread in the microphone responses, on the order of 25 dB, whereas the MIMO test saw spread that is more like within, just over 3 dB. The coherence is not controlled, but I'm showing it here. We measured it during the test. You can see that the coherence between microphones is almost 1 at the highest frequencies. The phase that I don't show in this plot, but I do show in the paper, is nearly 0 out to almost 140 hertz. And the coherence remains high above 0.9 for the entire frequency range. So this is the most diffuse, non-diffuse of the test fields that we used. It exhibits the poorest proper excitation of the expected test panel resonances, shows similar examples of phantom resonances and response enhancement and cancellation as we've seen in tests R5B and R4A, only to a worse extent. The following slide shows the response of the accelerometers, the 10 accelerometers. The RMSs that we see for each of the accelerometers is typically less than what we saw for the other three tests. The peaks of the resonances are not as well defined. And now keep in mind that this test is at the same overall sound pressure level as for the MIMO test. It's using the same reference profile, but yet the response of the test article is quite different than what we saw for the MIMO test, and very different from what we saw for the non-diffuse R5A. We see phantom resonances are also seen and these are peaks that are not in the modal analysis, as we see around 137 hertz, around 43.8 hertz, 65 hertz, 75 hertz, 85 hertz, 103 hertz. Actually, most of the low frequency resonances are not well excited. There's significantly more cancellation of resonances near 137.5, 156.2, and 165.6. A more detailed discussion will be presented later in the paper, where I discuss the comparison of one accelerometer response to the four acoustic fields on the same plot. On this slide, I'm showing you a detailed comparison of the PSDs we obtained from accelerometer number 4 for test R5A, the diffuse test, R5B, the moderate coherence non-diffuse test, R4A, the directed coherent field high coherence test, and R5E, which is a meso test, one that has multiple inputs and single outputs for control, and is the most highly coherent of the fields that we have. On this graph, what I have is the 4 traces for each one of the tests, where the dark blue trace is for test R5A, the green trace is for test R5B, the red trace is for test R4A, and the light blue trace is for R5E. Now let's discuss the results that we saw for test R5B, the green trace. The first notable thing is that the resonance at 43.8 was largely missed by that test. As you can see, the green trace shows no peak at 43.8, where you do see a peak on the dark blue trace at 43.8 hertz. And instead what you see is a peak that follows at up just over 50 hertz, what I would call a phantom resonance, a resonance that's not a resonance, but caused by a response enhancement phenomena, and is not a resonance that appears in the modal analysis. And then another area where it's very obvious there's a problem is in the area of 137.5 hertz, let's say 138 hertz. In that case, you can see that the light green trace, or the green trace, does not have a peak at 137.5 hertz, where I do have a cursor on the peak that R5A exhibits, and instead there's a peak that follows that's obscured slightly by the tag cursor tag notation that occurs around 140 hertz. So again, that's an example of a response cancellation that occurs in those 2 points where the resonances are largely missed. Now, the plot that we have for test R4A shows similar but more severe symptoms of the same kinds of problems. If we look at the red trace for R4A, you'll see that at 43.8 hertz, there's a notch, not a peak. And that instead a peak occurs higher up in the frequencies where I've got a cursor at 53.12 hertz. Again, here's the examples of response cancellation and enhancement side by side, just like we saw for the other diffuse test R5B, where a phantom resonance is appearing at 53.1 hertz. Higher up in the frequency, it's a little bit more severe in the sense that at 137.5 hertz for the red trace, we see a notch, which coincides with a peak in the R5A trace, and is surrounded by two other peaks, one at 128.1 hertz, as a cursor indicates, and another one at just over 140 hertz. Both of these would be called phantom resonances, resonances that are really not a resonance, but caused by the high coherence, in phase characteristics that are amplifying the responses on the plate at those frequencies, which are not resonant frequencies. Other resonances are also missed around 156 hertz. There's a peak at 158 hertz on the red trace. But more troublesome are these examples of what I would call resonance response enhancement, where, like, for example, at 209 hertz, I've got two cursors. On the red trace is the higher response, and then on the blue trace, right below it, which is the proper response. The response from test R4A is over 3.2 dB higher than the response for test R5A. There's another example just to the right of that peak at about 243 hertz, where you see a similar phenomenon where the response at R4A is higher than what we see for test R5A. Another example is around 66 hertz, not as bad. But these are examples of response enhancement and over test condition that occurs as a result of using a diffuse acoustic field. Now for test R5E, it's the meso test. It's even somewhat more severe because there's a lot of under test conditions that are occurring throughout the frequency range. The resonances are just not excited very well by the meso test, and this is the most highly coherent field. You can see that again at 43.8 hertz, there's no peak in the response of the light blue trace. It's quite lower than the other three traces, and instead there's a peak at around 50 hertz. Again, another phantom resonance. The light blue trace pretty much misses the resonance at 66 hertz. As you can see, the light blue trace being quite lower than the other three traces at 66 hertz. It reaches a slightly smaller level at the next resonance at 85 hertz, and then quite lower just at 109 hertz, the next resonance peak, and again misses the resonance at 137.5 hertz. The peak is slightly higher than 128 hertz, as you can see in the light blue trace. And then similar behavior occurs at other resonances. So by that measure, R5E is the poorest performer. R5A, on the other hand, has no such problems for accelerometer E4 and for the other accelerometers that were examined. I invite you to read the paper, which has all the details of the comparison, so you can see. So let me just say a few words about response enhancement and cancellation. Response enhancement occurs when the sound pressure waves in an acoustic field are coherent and in phase with particular structural resonance, or at intermediate such phase relationships, which would then be called partial enhancement. On the other hand, response cancellation occurs when the sound pressure waves in an acoustic field are coherent and out of phase with particular structural resonances, or at intermediate such phase relationships, which would then be partial cancellation. This phenomenon can also occur when standing waves are present in an acoustic field, as Dr. Kalani and others have shown for meso testing. But also when the acoustic field is used for testing highly coherent, non-diffuse, as this taper shows. Exciting structures with non-diffuse fields can either reinforce structural resonances or non-resonant frequencies, which cause phantom resonances, or which cancels or reinforces the response at bona fide resonances, response cancellation or enhancement. This is what causes the notch at 137.5 hertz and the peaks at 53.8, 128 hertz, 143.8, 159, and 209 hertz seen in the various discussed accelerometer responses for tests R5B, R4A, and R5E. The random phase and low coherence of diffuse acoustic fields, in the paper I show the phase response that you see for test R5A, so you can see that the phase is random throughout the frequency range, inhibits this effect from occurring, as shown by the data in this paper. So the conclusions we can reach on panel response comparisons that I've shown you, the presented analysis and detailed discussion in the paper demonstrates that only test R5A consistently excites all the resonances, particularly at 137.5 and the first 6 resonances. The focus is on the lowest frequency resonances, since these exhibit the largest stresses and strains due to their larger deflections. Test R5A is better than test R5B. R4A and R5E with a meso test R5E is noticeably the worst. The results underscore the importance of relative coherence and phase between microphones in determining the structural response of a test article during an acoustic test for a given reference spectra and overall sound pressure level. This result is not well known by many in the acoustic testing facility, as they concentrate primarily on the response of the diagonal elements, the conventional acoustic response spectrum that they look at. It's obviously affected by what the coherence and phase of the between microphones is as a result of the field that they're using for their testing. Now, the overall general conclusions I can draw from these results are that the presented analysis demonstrates that only the diffuse acoustic fields, such as test R5A, effectively excite and identify the structural resonances of a given test article. Non-diffuse tests like R5B, R4A, and R5E consistently miss exciting significant resonances properly, and many times find phantom resonances and may be subject to hotspots in the acoustic field. Achieve spectral density matrix coherence and phase between microphones with an acoustic field used to excite a test article are the most significant parameters of an acoustic test, in addition to the test overall sound pressure level and reference spectrum definition. All of these parameters determine the structural responses induced by an acoustic test using that field, as shown by this response study. Additional power utilization study in the paper shows that MIMO diffuse acoustic tests require only 1.3 dB more power than an equivalent meso test. Well, that's my paper. I hope you enjoyed it, found it interesting. If you have any questions, you may send these to me by email. My email address is m.underwood@msidfat.com. Thank you very much for listening. I'll be hearing from you later. Thank you very much.